All right, here we go. Lesson 13. We're going to look at FNMI, sociocultural considerations. A lot of the material from this particular lecture is based on these two documents, one from University of Saskatchewan and one from Orca Book called Speaking Our Truth, which is a Canadian publication. So you're welcome to go and look at those if you would like further information. Okay, let's jump right in. I don't think we can deny that there are difficulties for our FNMI communities in Canada, and we're going to kind of have a look at what those are over the next couple slides. So basically, there are Eurocentric privileges, frameworks, and norms. We live in Canada here in a Eurocentric society, and I think we need to raise consciousness that we do have this viewpoint and that it has been pervasive and it has had a negative impact on our Indigenous people. I don't think that we can deny that there's been historical discrimination and really current discrimination against our FNMI. And for one example, there's a high discrimination in our laws. There's a high incarceration rate for Indigenous people. We also have discrimination in our policies, in schools, in employment, and in lack of spiritual and faith inclusion. As we sort of see it as we see Indigenous culture as an outlier, as something that we sort of have to tolerate, and that is that historical discrimination that I think permeates our thinking in Canadian culture. Again, these are generalizations. There are, of course, people that don't believe that there's anything wrong with how our FNMI communities have been treated, and then there are those who are living this. So again, generally, I think we can say that there's been historical discrimination. Our FNMI colleagues also have had to deal with colonization and oppression. You know, we came in as white Europeans and basically took over. And in so doing, the FNMI communities were marginalized. They were pushed to the sides. They became powerless. There's a real sense of powerlessness, financially and in a voice affecting any kind of societal changes. There's exploitation going on, and there's some real violence going on. And there's an assumption that violence in those communities is okay, and that it's not something that we really need to deal with, and especially against women. So I'm going to just bring up here. Sorry, I'm going to go here. So this is make you a little ill there for a moment. This is from CBC News. These are unresolved cases against Indigenous women, and there's 308 cases right now that have never been solved and really are not a high priority to be solved. So it's just sad and interesting that these women do not get the same support from our justice system that potentially other cultural groups would get. Okay, so those are missing and murdered Indigenous women, where there's just not a lot of work being done to find out what happened. There's this assumption that, well, it happened on the reserve, it happened within the culture, so that's okay, and that there's this assumption that violence is okay, which we know it's not. Let's go on to number 3. Basically, in our culture, and again, it's definitely changing, but I think there's still a lot of assumption that Aboriginal knowledge, voice, and vision are not recognized as substantive. They're kind of seen as a nice way to look at the world, but it's not the way to look at the world in there. Okay. Some more difficulties, personal barriers. Again, sorry, just gonna flick here. Personal barriers. Again, lots of our Indigenous communities live in abject poverty. There's abuse is happening in the communities, and not because they are more abusive by nature, but because of because of the situation. And living conditions are really generally quite poor. Even though you'll hear people say, well, they have lots of money, why don't they have good living conditions? It's not necessarily true that they get enough money to then support the living conditions. Yes, of course, there's some abuse in some situations, but generally their living conditions are quite poor. So what I want you to do is I want you to stop me here. I want you to go to this CBC radio news report, and I want you to look for this video. This is how people get water on a reserve close to Toronto. And I want you to think about this. They don't have running water, which is kind of a given. And so I want you to watch the video and just think about if how we can say, oh yeah, living conditions are okay when they don't have a basic commodity of running water. Okay, so stop me, go watch this, and then come on back. Okay, number 5. Again, I think our Indigenous communities they're living with racism and assimilation right now. They're living it right now. There's an assumption of uniformity. We have even the term FNMI. It lumps several cultures together. And right now in Alberta, there are upwards of 73, in Canada, not Alberta, there are upwards of 73 languages and different living situations across Canada. And so again, when we say FNMI, even that's kind of an assumption of that those communities are uniform. Okay. Again, I think generations will live with the damage, the historical damage that has been done. And again, I just want to go to this Orca book and go to some of these stories. So this was, again, your reading, but I want to these are some of the survivors from residential schools, and these are just some of the quotes that this Orca book series has brought together. So even now, when I know nothing could be further than the truth, I still sometimes feel that I don't matter. So what you can do is I believe you can go to these particular, oh no, some of them have more stories, I think, but these are just the quotes in here. Whereas when I first came home, how mad the elders were at me, mad because I couldn't speak or understand the language. So this is when Fred John came home from residential schools. The elders were mad at him because he didn't fit. And so then he's in this netherland of not fitting into white dominant culture and then not fitting into his Indigenous culture. And so these kids who were part of the 60s scoop of being taken away into residential schools lived kind of in this spot. And his favorite saying, this next one here from Keith, his favorite saying was, "I'm the most even-tempered man in the world. I'm mad all the time." And it really did describe my dad. So these are real stories. These are real people that are living with this this burden of residential schools and of really prejudice and discrimination currently. And finally, number 7. This is kind of a heavy lecture, but I think it's a really important lecture, again, for you as teachers going out into the schools. Education does not make sense to some of our Indigenous students. We have an idea of post-colonial pedagogy of knowledge and learning is that we tend to view knowledge as separate from the land and separate from each other. So we separate math, we separate language arts, we separate social, we separate science. Whereas an Indigenous student will look at it as a collective, right? They'll look at it as why don't we base it on the land? our knowledge on the land, and why don't we look at everything from a collective experience versus such a siloed look at all of these subjects. And even the concept of going to school and not learning from your immediate family or community is really foreign to some of our Aboriginal concepts of knowledge. So the key attributes of Indigenous learning, I'm just going to read these to you. Learning is holistic, it is lifelong, it is experiential, it is rooted in Aboriginal languages and cultures, it is spiritually oriented, it's a communal activity, and it integrates Aboriginal and Western knowledge. So all of those things, we have some of those in our school systems, but our school system is not based on holistic, lifelong, experiential, rooted in Aboriginal languages. It's and spiritual connection. Our schools are not rooted in those. And so education, as you probably went through, as I went through, as you are going through in this education program, it doesn't make sense to some of our Indigenous students, because education is actually seen quite differently. And so for them to get their head around what is going on here is a big thing. And again, as a teacher, you need to be aware that if you have a child with an Indigenous background, they may not understand why you're separating things, or their point of view might be so different from yours that you think they don't understand, but they actually really understand, but they understand it from a different perspective. Okay, really super interesting stuff that again, you need to be aware of as a teacher. Okay, so I just put on here, if you are looking for some impactful stories around Indigenous experience, both as children and in residential schools and in schools currently, these are some really amazing books. And I'm going to read you I Am Not a Number in Collaborate, so be ready for that. All of these books are in the library, in the MHC library, if you ever want to just have a look at some of these. What I want you to do in Collaborate is I want you to watch this YouTube clip on your own. It's about 6-7 minutes, and it's Nocum is My Teacher. It's read by the author, David Bouchard. And I want you to be ready to discuss and collaborate the view of knowledge, school, teachers, reading, dominant white culture, and learning in Collaborate. So listen to the book, jot some notes down about the view of these things, and be ready to talk about them in Collaborate. I think it's a super book, and David Bouchard is an amazing Canadian writer. Okay, so let's continue on here. I'm just going to click over here. So Aboriginal education, sorry, I'm ahead of myself on this one. Aboriginal education risk factors. So basically, okay, so this is a picture at the bottom. This is a picture of the Siksika Reserve. And I must admit that when I moved from Calgary to Medicine Hat 5 years ago, we drove through here, and I had never seen this particular reserve because I had, hadn't driven these roads too often before I moved here. And I remember coming down the hill into the Siksika Reserve, and I went, wow, what is this place? It has a really interesting vibe to it, and it wasn't necessarily a really positive vibe. And as I got closer, I saw the sign that said Siksika Reserve, and I went, oh wow, that's really interesting. And I got thinking about sort of all the things that we've just been talking about around our Indigenous communities, is the sense of poverty, the sense of isolation, like they're quite isolated physically. I got thinking about the kids that were on this reserve and what their schooling would be about. And so it was really interesting for me as a white middle class woman to think about, okay, I need to widen my perspective of what's happening within the FNMI community within my province. Okay, so some of the risk factors for our FNMI students are, some of them will have early school failures. Some of them will not come to school with any kind of literacy background or school skills. So then right from the start, they're behind, which is tricky to catch up. Sometimes you'll have students moving from school to school. It depends on home and situation, but they may be switching homes, and then they may be switching schools, which again is always traumatic for kids. And if they don't have that support, it might impact how they view school later on in their life. Sometimes, again, these are generalizations. This is not all the time. Sometimes there's a lack of parent support. There's a whole generation that they don't have parenting skills because of being taken away into residential schools where they were not with they were not with their families through really crucial periods of their lives. And so there are some parents of the students that you will teach that actually don't have those parent role models. And so it's tricky to parent your own kids when you don't have any role models. So you also may have parents who don't believe in the school system. So then you're battling that as a teacher, that here you are trying to push this child to do things, and they're going home and the parents are potentially saying, this white dominant schooling is not actually going to be any good for you. So again, generalizations, but I think you need to be aware that some of these are some of the things that your students may be coming to school with. There's a lack of teachers with Aboriginal knowledge. There are a lot of us white middle class teachers going out into schools and going on to reserve schools, and we just don't have that sociocultural background of knowing how our FNMI students look at the world. Okay, living in remote communities. Again, if they really want to go to maybe junior high or high school, they have to leave the support of their family and go somewhere else for further schooling, which again is hard and it's traumatic. There's generally a lack of resources on these reserves. There's not a lot of extra things, extracurricular groups, literacies, opportunities, and so often there's a lot of poverty on the reserves, and so there's just that lack of resources for these kids to have anything extra. And special needs. There might be some situations where there's fetal alcohol syndrome, so that's causing a whole other issues. Sometimes trauma of home life will really impact cognitive development of our children, or how they interact with other kids will be affected by their home life. So again, these are some real risk factors that you need to be aware of that our Indigenous students may be bringing to the classroom. Okay, so this is Marie Baptiste. She is the University of Saskatchewan professor who I really enjoy her work on schooling and FNMI. And basically she says, is education on the right track? So schools cannot be the doctor if they continue to be the disease. So she is saying that if we as schools don't address our Eurocentric views, and that FNMI communities have been discriminated against for decades, then schools will continue to be the disease and they will not be the doctor. So these are a couple of her quotes. We need to become critical learners and healers within a wounded space. We need to take a critical look at our curriculum guides, our textbooks, our support resources, our post-secondary training. We need to reclaim FNMI history, voice, arts, oral, and literary traditions at post-secondary in order for you to then be able to take that knowledge out into the schools. Okay, so I thought this was a super interesting quote. Schools cannot be the doctor if they continue to be the disease. Okay. Let's see. So these are 2011 stats. Unfortunately, I could not find more recent stats than that, so hopefully it's gotten better, but I am assuming it hasn't. So for our students between age 25 to 64, 48.4% of Aboriginal students have a post-secondary training, either in trades, college, or university. 64.7 is the norm for non-Aboriginal. So definitely lower. 28.9 Aboriginal have no degree versus 12.1. 22.8 Aboriginal students have high school diploma as their highest education, and 23.2 non. So that's actually we are seeing a pretty good graduation rate, but then going on into any kind of degree or post-secondary training really starts to lack. Again, you can see poverty, not really seeing education as a way to improve life, those kind of things in there. Okay, so as a start, education needs to encourage and train our teachers to recognize colonial views and racism in system. Hopefully, throughout your education, either here at MHC or wherever you go, you will be introduced to Indigenous views on culture, on and on education, so that you can start to go, okay, I'm starting to recognize these things, and I can actually use them as legitimate ways of looking at the world and legitimate knowledge base. Okay, we also need to encourage and train teachers in post-colonial anti-racist methodologies. So hopefully through like this kind of a lecture, you're going, oh, okay, I hadn't thought about it that way, but now I do. We need to honor Indigenous knowledge in science, humanities, and visual arts. Again, not just think of it as I did my token Indigenous unit, and now I can go back to thinking about everything from a white Eurocentric system. We have to be integrating everything that we do with an Indigenous voice. And we need to develop teachings that draw from ecological diversity and create a renewed reliance on the land and our interconnectivity. I think we're starting to see that in the sort of the general public, that, wow, as we deal with climate change and environmental issues, that knowledge that we need to be considering the land, and we need to consider how we're connected to the land as not just fun and fanciful, but as essential, I think is starting to come more into our mainstream thinking. Okay, helping our FNMI students, again, we want to be thinking about early intervention. So students who feel connected to the school and have a positive school experience, hopefully are more engaged. We want to catch those kids who are coming, who are lacking literacy and numeracy skills. We want to catch them early. Absolutely catch them early. We want to develop their resiliency. So we want them to learn leadership skills. We want them to be empowered to contribute to our classroom from their point of view, and not give them the sense that they can only contribute once they have adopted our point of view. We want them also to have a positive self-image. So students who are provided opportunities to explore their own identities in a positive manner are more motivated to achieve. So we want them to have a positive self-image. We want to try to engage their families as much as possible, because again, if we engage with those parents and those kids see us talking with the parents, the package just makes sense. There's not this disconnect between parent and school. We also want to have community involvement, where students are involved in their communities, are more successful. So we want to give them amazing education within their communities so they don't have to go away, and support them within their communities. We want to have relevant programming, again, things that are more relevant and reflect Aboriginal language, Aboriginal culture. Again, if they're never seeing themselves in books, if they're never seeing their ideologies in lectures, in content, they're going to shut down. So we need to be thinking about how can we make our actual programming relevant, and how can we bring in Aboriginal role models. Again, they feel more comfortable. Our students will feel more comfortable in school when they have contact with role models who have their same cultural background, and that's super important. Okay. In collaborate, we are going to talk about what are other ways we can aid our Indigenous students in the education system. So I want you to bring in ideas from your reading from this class, from other classes, from community, from your own experiences, from what you've read on Twitter, from what you've read in the Medicine Hat News. Again, I want you to start to bring in ideas that are floating around out there, and maybe start to identify some as white Eurocentric view and some as definitely starting to take in that FNMI worldview. So again, we're going to have a go with some of these ideas. So come with some ideas so that you can contribute and collaborate. And finally, again, just be writing down some quotes that you would like to hear yourself saying so that it shows your understanding of sociocultural awareness, particularly around FNMI, your FNMI students in the future. Okay, awesome. Hope you have a good rest of your day, and we will see you soon.